totally.
Yeah.
Are you on it? Nice to see I just don't know. I think it's some garage in the front room, especially today.
Okay, yeah, let's see. Good. Yeah, just, I think this is yes. Good. It's fine. I feel you talk about it. I like the shot there. It's like, I think that's how it that's fine.
Because people are doing that.
Okay, that sounds good. Alright.
Am I audible? Welcome to McNally Jackson. We are thrilled to be presenting the U.S. edition of This Is Not a Border tonight. See there's some copies handsomely displayed there. You can pick them up after the event. And we're thrilled to welcome the Palestinian Festival of Literature, or PalFest, which was established in 2008 with the aim of showcasing and supporting cultural life in Palestine and breaking the cultural siege imposed by the Israeli military occupation. I will introduce next a friend of the store whose work we admire a great deal, Omar Robert Hamilton. You can see The City Always Wins. It came out just last month and we have copies there. He's an award-winning filmmaker and writer and the co-founder of the Palestinian Festival of Literature. You're welcome, Ghazi Wally Crabapple. Thank you so much for coming. Without further ado, Omar Robert Hamilton.
Right, hi, hello. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Cam and McNally Jackson, for having us tonight. So tonight we're launching This Is Not a Border. This is a collection of essays and poems and diaries collected and assembled over 10 years of PalFest, the Palestine Festival of Literature, which is an annual festival that tours around occupied Palestine. And the idea at its centre being that because Palestinians can't move freely between their own cities, we take the festival to them. It's been 10 years. We find now, 10 years in, there are very few writers that we approach that do not want to go to Palestine. I think we've seen a very distinct cultural shift in the way that Palestine is talked about in the West in the last 10 years. And I think that the collection is a sort of interesting marker of this particular moment in time, the sort of 2017 moment in the struggle for justice in Palestine and the narratives around that and the way that people talk about it and write about it and think about it. And I think there are some very, very interesting pieces in there. So I'm very pleased to be able to present that to you tonight. Thank you very much to Molly Crabapple and Remy Kanazi for joining us tonight. Really the hardest working political artists around today. I really think that the way that they work, the way that they engage with the media, the way that they think about their craft is a sort of model for some kind of modern, engaged artist. And I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation with them. Molly Crabapple, you have seen her autobiography, Drawing Blood. It had a very big release a couple of years ago. Really, really interesting book that details her progression as a sort of visual artist firstly, and then progressing into becoming a written sort of journalist as well. Her new book is called Brothers of the Gun, which is coming out next year?
Next spring.
Next spring, and is a collaboration between her and a Syrian artist, and I've seen a couple of the sort of pieces that are going to go into that, and they're heartbreakingly beautiful. Remy Kanazi came to Belfast on 2010, and then again a couple of years ago. He's been a working poet for as long as I've known him, and is really a tireless performer and one of the best and most kind of well-spoken and well-argued advocates for Palestine working the scene today. And I think really he's such a sort of credit to the way that we engage with narrative struggles over this issue and over wider issues of justice and racism and colonialism. His first book was called Poetic Injustice, and his follow-up, which came out in 2015 with Haymarket, is a really powerful collection of work called Before the Next One Drops, which you can get here. Remy is going to perform one piece today for us, and but yeah, otherwise we're going to have a conversation basically. We're going to have a chat up here. We'll talk, I guess, for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So, thank you for joining us, and I guess we should sit. Okay, are these things loud enough? Is everybody fine? It's really impossible to tell from here. Great. Okay, so I thought we could start with Molly, and one of the things I thought reading Drawing Blood was it's really notable that how, for you as an artist, you kind of have a pre-2011 way of thinking about your work and your role in the world, and a post-2011 way of thinking about your work. And I'm of the school that thinks that really the world did change in a very significant way in 2011. Maybe it's a generation, maybe it's not something that applies to every generation, I'm not sure, but certainly for the people around me and the context that I'm familiar with, which is sort of, you know, America, Egypt, Palestine, and I guess sort of UK. I really feel like the world shifted dramatically in 2011, and we are kind of still living in a moment of the kind of post-2011. And yeah, I kind of wanted to open and put that to you and say, you know, do you agree with that? Do you think we are in this sort of moment still? And how do you feel your kind of role as an artist is today?
I absolutely agree that we're in the aftermath of 2011. Whether that aftermath is a hangover or whether that aftermath is something else, I don't know. It certainly seems like a hangover at this particular moment, to put it kindly. For me, 2011 will always be the year that people around the world realized that fundamentally the old machine was broken, that it could not go on any longer, and where people from Egypt to New York to Greece to England to Madrid sat down in central squares of their city and said, this cannot stand anymore. This fundamentally is corrupt and rotten and it cannot stand. It was a fundamental challenge to the way that the world was. And I think for so many of us, certainly me, we break our lives into the period before and the period after, where we and our work and our art became intricately entangled with the struggles that were going on in the streets and struggles that were going on in power. Now, 2011 felt like love, right? And love, that first moment of love, it's a transitory thing, and sometimes the times you love most are the times that it breaks most horribly. And at this moment, in 2017, when we're living in a country being governed by an orange fascist, and when demagogues around the world are rising, many of them using the same digital tools that we thought were our own, it's easy to see 2011 not as the first moments of love, but as the first moments of something else, of the machine breaking in a terrible, terrible way. And I suppose I think it's both. So, we all like to quote Gramsci at these things, or misquote Gramsci. I'm going to butcher a Gramsci quote that I'm sure we all know, which is the that when the old world is dying and the new world is coming into being, well, I didn't go to grad school, so I can't use the word that he did, but so I'm going to say the middle space. The middle space is the time of monsters.
What is it? Is it liminal?
No, it's the interregnum or something. I don't even know. It's middle space.
Yeah. So Remy, for as long as I've known you, you've been a working poet. I mean, and you first came to Palestine in 2010, and you already had a sizable audience then, and so you'd obviously been working. When did you start working as a poet, and what was your kind of trigger moment into poetry? When did you choose that as to be your tool?
Sure, yeah. You know, I moved to New York City 4 months before 9/11, and when those two towers came down, there was a lot of vitriolic language. We got to go and turn the Middle East into a parking lot. We got to nuke them and start over. But I think the pivotal point was actually in 2004 when my brother and sister took me to go see Def Poetry Jam on Broadway. And also one of the authors that's featured in this book, it was the first time I saw Suhair Ahmed perform live. And I remember going home that night and writing a terrible poem. And then another terrible poem, and then hopefully eventually a less terrible poem. And so for me, it's like I felt like the average 19-year-old didn't necessarily want to connect with an op-ed or watch cable news, but they could connect with spoken word or hip-hop or art. And so for me, spoken word was a way I could get a political message across through a cultural medium. And I mean, I quite literally became a poet because I saw poets and they pushed me out of my seat. So in that kind of like action-oriented sense, I wanted to pick up with that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole generation of poets that were inspired, or became poets because of Suhair Ahmed. You know, they were writers, with quite a phenomenal impact. So, you both often express a sort of ambivalence about art, or the role of art, or what it is you can achieve with your mediums. Remy, you have a poem in this book called "This Poem Will Not End Apartheid," and I thought perhaps we could hear that from you.
Okay, sure, yeah. So this poem I wrote back in like 2010. So I'm gonna need a book to, I'm gonna do without a mic. I'm a loud poet, I'm gonna shatter some stereotypes. So basically it's like, right, we live in a country, we give Israel $3.5 billion a year in military aid, we send over Apache helicopters and Hellfire missiles, we act as Israel's veto inside and outside the UN. So the question is like, what are we going to do about it? Palestinians have been very clear, like, we're not victims in need of aid, we're an occupied people in need of freedom, and US tax dollars, community investments, and campus investments are standing in the way of that freedom. So this piece is about boycott, divestment, and sanctions for the 10 people that don't know what that is. In 2005, civil society, Palestinian civil society, called for boycott, divestment, and sanctions until it complied with 3 basic demands: ending the occupation, allowing refugees to return, and equality for all Palestinians living inside of the state of Israel. So this piece is about that. This poem will not end apartheid. My words, no matter how beautiful, clever, or carefully strung together, won't end the occupation, allow the refugees to return, or create equality within Israeli society. The status quo, it's a fantasy, telling us it's okay to sit on our hands, called political art propaganda, rather than those who propaganda our lies, propagandists. Every American should ask themselves this question: why are bombs and white phosphorus getting dropped on open-air prisons with money that should be going to pay for your medical expenses? And dear academics and leftists, I appreciate your books on Israeli massacres, but you refuse to take the bullets out of IDF guns with your stances. The problem is not just the occupation or putting a better face on Zionism, because 750,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed before those settlements were constructed, half of them before Israel was even created. We don't need another book explaining the situation. Except maybe this one. We don't need another book explaining the situation. We need. I messed that up. That's what I get for. We don't need another book explaining the situation. We need a lesson plan to stop the next bomb from dropping. Silence is complicity. Over-intellectualization tells us to theorize on the power of art. While farmers are kicked off land, while farmers are kicked off land, children are stolen on the way to school. People are caged in, beaten and split from loved ones, bombed and broken in blockaded dungeons, bought and paid for with our tax dollars. We're part of the problem. That's not theoretical. It's time to boycott all Israeli products and go to the root of the conflict. Every 729 cultural institution and dialogue farce, from Sabra to Ahava, Max Brenner to Aroma, Lev Levayev and SodaStream, switching drink preferences stacks up little to 60 years of continued confiscation. Finally, to the artists, building bridges between apartheid and normalization, you serve an agenda that rebrands colonialism as enlightened liberalism. Concerts, ballets, and raves in Israel's Sun City, a haven and party stop for pinkwashers who callously ignore Palestinian LGBT groups fighting against all systems of oppression. Palestinian civil society has spoken. Don't cross this picket line or cash in that paycheck signed apartheid. Cancel that gig. Put down stolen beauty and join the rest of us on the right side of history.
Well, we always put Remy on as the closing act in Hellfest. Yeah, I mean, when you said picket line, it's sort of worth, I wonder if we should talk later about, well, I don't know if there's much to talk about, but it's notable what's going on with Radiohead right now, and this sort of blanket refusal to even meet with or hear from Palestinian advocates. It's quite stunning. It's really a sort of very trenchant, middle-aged kind of crappy position he's holding. Yeah, Molly, in Drawing Blood, this one line stood out for me. It's very simple, but it was very poignant when I read it. It said, what's the point of art in a world so full of hell? And I think it's a question that people are trying to deal with all the time. I think it's a question that presents itself a lot, particularly in these years, sort of post-2013, I guess, in the end, the kind of crushing of the Arab Spring and the sort of violence that we've been seeing ever since then. Yeah, I don't know. What do you tell yourself, and how do you answer that question long enough to work?
A lot of the art that I do and a lot of the journalism that I do involves going to places where people are being crushed by the sort of oppression and injustice of the world, and still standing up, not being victims, but being crushed. I mean, my last sort of big investigative piece, I snuck into refugee hotspots in Greece. These barbed wire ringed, squalid hellholes that people are trapped in because they want to move and because they want to leave war zones. And so I would sit in these places, right, and I'd sit with my sketchbook and I would talk to people. And the last camp that I went to, I went in, this very nice lady from Aleppo took me through a hole in the fence, and this young Palestinian guy comes up to me and he says, thank you for being here. It's really nice that you're here, but you really think your article is going to change anything? Because there have been a lot of articles and nothing's changed. And I thought about it for a second, and I said, no, I don't think it'll change anything, but you need to keep a record anyway, and also maybe it'll make some bastards uncomfortable. And he took that as an okay answer. And, I don't think that the pen is mightier than the sword, and, our songs and pictures are going to tear down the walls of tyranny. I think that far more concrete things tear down the walls of tyranny. But I also think that a world in which there is no art, in which there are no songs, in which there is no poetry, is not a world worth living in. And that in a world so full of hell, in addition to fighting the bastards, we also need to create glimmers of the type of world that we do want to live in, and that's something that art can do.
Yeah. No, I wonder if also one of the things that the violent side wants to extinguish is imagination. It feels like a lot of time, the possibility of imagining different things, and I guess that's also one of the things I try and think about as a sort of one of the things that we can do that is actually of value is to sort of to continue imagining different possibilities. And I mean, when we're also sort of analysing what's going on now, I think in both of your work there's a very clear, regular insistence on seeing what we call the intersections of empire, sexism, racism, capitalism, and I mean, it's almost, they're not even intersections, it is just a natural way of seeing the whole world. And Remy, I was struck by a line in one of your poems where you sort of does this triplet, where when trying to talk about Israel, I think one of the struggles is always like, there isn't one word or one expression that we have that actually sums up all the things that Israel is doing, and certainly not in popular consciousness. So we constantly have to have this, we have this sort of literary feat in front of us all the time of having to sort of say multiple things or list multiple things that kind of somehow between them can sum up all the different things Israel is doing. And you've got this triplet where you're like, squatter of colonies, usurper of aquifers, exploiter of occupied labour, these very sort of staccato, kind of unpleasant lines, and it kind of, and I've realised I had done a similar thing in my essay in this book. It was, you know, it's like you're kind of always reaching to sort of list all of the different shitty things that it's doing, because otherwise how can you possibly understand, you know, that it's not just one issue, but it's a combination of sort of ecological plunder and basic racism and patriarchal dominance, and they all come together in Israel. And so thinking about all of those things and how you want to take them on, I mean, how do you take them all on as artists? I mean, what do you have as tools other than the list? Do you have tools other than the list? I do.
Yeah, I mean, so obviously the poem I performs is a little more fiery, and then there's pages that there's pieces that you're delving into where you're imagining things through a story, or you're relaying a story. Like, it doesn't just have to, because I think that when it comes to Palestine, you think about 2,300 killed and siege and blockade, but you don't think about the strawberry farmer. You don't think about the person that's not able to get to school. So I think that emotionally you try to kind of balance it, whether it's through a sad piece or an angry piece or a funny piece, but also the kind of like different textures and layers to the stories that you're telling, that sometimes is meant more for the page, other times meant a bit more for the stage, and then sometimes a kind of intersection of the two. But like when it comes to the different topics, you know, writing on Palestine, I think that there used to be a lot of folks that were one issue focused, but I think for me it's like, it's not that the Palestinian people are any more special than anyone else, it's to say that no one should live under occupation, nobody should live under a system of apartheid, nobody should see their families ethnically cleansed. So for me, like, yes, I'm Palestinian, but I didn't come out of the womb asking to be Palestinian. If we're not fighting against drone bombing overseas, or anti-black racism and police violence in the US, and transphobia in our local communities, and gender violence on college campuses, then what kind of liberation are we actually fighting for? So it's really to say that Palestine matters in that life matters, you know, and so I think that the way that the solidarity organizations have taken it up, and Palestinians, you know, so I think that like the idea that Palestinians are kind of one strand of people, and we don't live at these intersections, or we don't have multiple identities within Palestinian society, is not an actual representation of what Palestine looks like.
And the truth is, I mean, people are not, they're not single identities in any way. You're not merely an American, or a man, or a Palestinian, or people are, you know, multiplicities and universes inside themselves that experience oppression and life and joy in myriad ways. And one of the things that apartheid states like Israel do is they reduce people down to that single element. They say, you are a Palestinian living on the West Bank, you can't travel on these roads. You are a Gazan, you are caged inside of this thing because of this identity that you're born with that makes the entire multiplicity of you, and that subsumes you. That's an essential tool of any repressive state. And I think that in our politics and in our art, to fight against that, we have to be intersectional. There's no other option. You can't have an analysis that's as flattening as the people that you're opposing.
Do you think that's happening in the States now that you know, now that the battleground really is here and the opposition to Trump has to be urgent and effective? I mean, I was just reading Naomi Klein's book, and she's talking about how, I mean, she has a sort of she's quite optimistic in a way, and she sees that really there is a sort of intersectionality growing, and that there's people working across issues together, and thinks that this is a sort of new moment where this is happening. Do you see that happening? Do you think that's happening? Both of you guys, you're both very involved here.
Oh God, yes, I certainly do. I mean, you know, when you saw something like the first protests against the Muslim ban, right, where you have organized labor in the form of the Taxi Drivers Alliance, who are also largely immigrants, many of them Muslim, and you also have like, you know, like nice Upper West Siders who probably like donate to Planned Parenthood but haven't done a whole lot of direct action in their life, and you have like Latino immigrant groups, and you have every other manner of people that are converging down to airports and saying, no, we're not going to ban people from 7 nations, we're not going to allow this racist ban to happen. I mean, to me that is solidarity, and so much of the organizing that I've been seeing has been like that. On May Day, I was at a protest that was in front of B&H, which is a photography supply store that is currently involved in a union battle with its workers. And these largely Mexican warehouse workers were picketing B&H. And one of the signs was like Latinos and Muslims together. This is at a union protest. And I see things like that all of the time, and I think that as the battle lines are getting so clearly drawn between people who want an open society and people who want an ethno-nationalist kleptocracy, people are going to have to stick together, and they're going to have to support each other.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like on the organizing front, I mean, I've been organizing primarily on Palestine for a long time, and you know, to see the different, whether it's cross-community solidarity building or a campus group that's working on a divestment campaign from prisons and also fossil fuels and Israeli occupation. You know, if you look at like the Organization for Black Struggle in St. Louis Palestine Solidarity Committee in St. Louis working together on a Veolia campaign before the execution of Mike Brown and the bombing on Gaza. So I think that it also draws upon like a larger history, right? There's been more talk about Black Palestinian solidarity, but you know, this is something that's been part of the communities, US, South Africa, Palestine for the last 60 plus years. So I think that there's kind of like new iterations and there's new momentums for it. But I also think that, yeah, like I was saying, I think that people used to be a little bit more single issue focused. They're not only realizing that we need to be more intersectional, they also see how oppressors are profiting off of multiple systems of oppression. So Elbit Systems working on the US-Mexico border, and also drones in Palestine, HP working with the Department of Homeland Security, also sending over biometric technology to segregate Palestinians. So I think that like, or police departments working with the Israeli army. So not just on the question of Palestine, but I think across the board, people are saying that why do we spend $2.1 million a year to put a soldier in Afghanistan, but we don't have access to healthcare, hospitals, and schooling? So, so even also adding in the kind of class element to it too, where you have, you know, billionaires and folks that are looking to kind of like profit off of people and are more interested in bombs than they are social services.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think in Europe, on the Palestine front, I feel like in Europe there have been some pretty significant victories on the boycott issue. I mean, we've seen Veolia pull out because of pressure in France against building the light railway in Jerusalem that was connecting illegal settlements to West Jerusalem, and the mobile phone operator Orange pulled out, and there have been some pretty significant victories over there. We're kind of waiting for our first big corporate victory here, I guess. There have been the pension funds, there hasn't been like a big corporate victory here yet.
I see Adela in New York in the audience. No, yeah, I mean, a lot of these are multinational corporations, so we like to claim those victories in the US as well.
Yeah, so no, I was just sort of drifting into thinking about, yeah, and of course, like part of this is the media and how we engage with the media and what the media, how the media presents the world to its viewers. And you're both very media engaged artists, I think, and you're both very savvy about how to use it and about what its potentials are. Although Remy, I would say you almost have like a kind of adversarial relationship with the mainstream media almost, probably inevitably from your
You don't
years.
chat much. That was like my happy poem, like FYI, so.
Yeah, and Molly, I mean, I feel like the way that you talk about the media, it's almost as if it's something that you know that it can sometimes be co-opted because it's always seems to be trying to commodify you. And so there's a way in which you can kind of get into the game with it. Where are you both on that now? I mean, how do you engage with the media? Do you think that the media has been changing recently? Do you think that it's going to improve in terms of these kind of narratives over justice that we're trying to promote or trying to get out into the sort of mainstream consciousness?
Oh God, well, on a personal level, I've basically been wanting to hide from the media and, I don't know, basically hide in my apartment and translate obscure Arabic poetry and never go out again, but that's just because I'm burnt out. In terms of what I think about the mainstream media, I mean, okay, the mainstream media is really easy to bust on because it's lame and publishes wrong things all the time and, you know, is often deeply biased while assuming a posture of lofty objectivity. However, in some ways I feel a need to also speak up for the mainstream media at this historical junction because the other forms of media, the non-mainstream media, are certainly no better and can often be much worse. We're living at a time when the mainstream media's faults are so glaring and when information is both so plentiful but also so unverified and so questioned. And when state actors from all sorts of states, from Israel to Russia to Turkey, are involved in trying to essentially subvert the notion of truth, to deny their own war crimes and atrocities, I do think that the mainstream media can play a good function, which is verifying that things actually did happen. And I think that the fundamental challenge to the legitimacy of the mainstream media that has been going on now, while it's, I mean, deeply deserved, and I know I sound so square saying this, is also actually fundamentally dangerous. Because the people who are doing it are not just, you know, like cool radicals. It's also states trying to deny that they use white phosphorus.
Do you think there ever was an objective truth at the centre of society that we all kind of had some kind of access to through the media and that's now been fragmented?
I mean, in some ways, of course, the objective truth that we had access to often was, you know, a consensus-based lie, right? Like that there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But there was the notion that truth existed, which, and I used to always, I feel like kind of guilty about this, I used to always be like, oh, there is no objectivity, man, you know, there is no truth, we all, like, you know, are seeing things from our own point of view. But actually, like, there is truth, like Israel did, you know, drop white phosphorus on Gaza, and it's not a matter of, you know, subjectivity that they did that. And I think, you know, the mainstream media at its very best with the verification and the rigor and the fact-checking that it brings to things can serve an important role. But often it's terrible too.
Yeah, I mean, if you mean on Palestine,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, you don't get a fair shake. I mean, I think that from mainstream outlets, even so-called progressive outlets, coverage of Palestine has been absolutely terrible. I think that it's changed minorly over the last couple of years in terms of placement of op-eds. You know, instead of like 100 racist op-eds a year, it's like there's only 90 against Palestinians, and then it's like, oh look, 3 Palestinian voices and a quote in a year. I mean, I think that like where kind of like Twitter and Facebook and other mediums have come in and democratized in the sense without getting into like BS notions of like the Twitter revolution in Egypt, is that on the Palestine front online, you know, if you have 80,000 followers on Twitter, but the Washington Post editor only has 4,000, that person can no longer ignore you. They have more power than you. They can still smear you and write terrible stories. But after a while, they're going to have to respond to you. So in that sense, I think there have been some kind of victories where it's like Israel has billions of dollars a year in military aid, and it has millions of dollars that it's pumping into a PR infrastructure and something it calls Brand Israel to kind of whitewash its crimes against Palestinians. But online, it's really had a problem finding footing, where it's like you're paying people to tweet, and then the Israeli army comes out with a promoted tweet, it gets taken over by Palestinians and allies, and they have egg in their face at the end of the day. You know, that's not the same thing as stopping a settlement from expanding, but I do think that in local communities, on campuses, with media support, things are shifting. So it's that kind of idea where you could barely say the word Palestine 10 years ago without being called an anti-Semite, and then looking at 150 Students for Justice in Palestine chapters, more coalition and progressive and intersectional support than ever before. So, you know, maybe we're at stage 3 of 25, but you felt like you were at stage 1 for so long that it kind of feels good that you're on this pace, while at the same time holding the reality that in some ways things have never been worse in Palestine. So I think kind of looking at it through that nuanced way where like there had been some victories, we don't want to deny those victories, but we don't want to strip away some of the larger realities that are keeping down Palestinians, and also the springing back repression that's happening inside of the US, from anti-BDS bills to administrators and campuses taking action against students.
I mean, in terms of Palestine, one thing where I think Twitter actually was really helpful and where I very much agree with you was during the 2014 invasion of Gaza, people inside Gaza were photographing and documenting what was happening to them. They were documenting, the children that were killed. They were documenting the hospitals that were bombed. And no matter how much, the IDF spokesman account tries to have a, neatly photoshopped pie chart of what a great job they're doing, that kind of falls flat when you're seeing actual, real proof of war crimes happening. And these people inside Gaza documenting the effects of the invasion, using this tool, were able to challenge, probably one of the best funded propaganda departments in the world.
So, I don't know, I was wondering do you have specific, is there something that you want to achieve within your reader when you're writing? Is there a specific goal that you have? Is there something that what do you want your audience to do when they finish reading your work?
I suppose for me, I want people to realize that the world is radically more complicated and painful and beautiful than they thought before, and I want them to experience sorts of empathy, not compassion, but empathy for people that they never imagined they could experience it for.
Yeah, I'd say I think it's important to educate. I think it's critical to advocate, but it's essential that we take action. And not just on the issue of Palestine, whatever, I perform a lot on campuses and talk to students, whether you're, working for your queer coalition, whether you're working on Native issues in Standing Rock, whether it's environmental, we kind of got to get up and act. And, if you're feeling apathetic, back last October, this is now a good time to do it. And so, on the issue of Palestine, whether it's engaging in a consumer boycott campaign, academic or cultural boycott, supporting local divestment, but really I think that the more people are standing up and acting locally on their campuses, in their communities, the better off we're going to be for it. And it's operating with that idea that those small steps do create a big wave. I don't think that if NYU passes divestment tomorrow, that stops a bomb from dropping. But it's, when you look at South Africa and the call out for BDS in the 1950s, when do we define success? In 1991, in the mid-1980s, when California passes divestment. So I think it's a marathon, not a sprint. So getting people to be engaged and getting them to take action, whatever your kind of issue is and what you're passionate about.
Yeah. I think the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign is really one of the kind of most exciting bits of activism going on in the world, and one of the easy ways for people to get involved when they feel like they want to do something about Palestine. And since we're in New York, we should mention that there's sort of a new front has just opened up now, where the Lincoln Center has invited 2 Israeli theatre companies to perform, and they both play in settlements, and they both receive funding from the Israeli government. And there's a sort of new campaign now to get the Lincoln Center to actually pull those performances, and some very interesting, high-profile American dramatists signed on to a letter. And it's sort of every day, a new front in this sort of battle opens up where, on the one hand you have this very highly paid propaganda machine coming out of the Israeli government, paying to promote art all over the place and sort of actually calling it brand Israel. And on the other you've got this sort of global, decentralized, civilian, volunteer kind of growing core that's trying to shut it down. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything to that one.
Yeah, look, just to say, because I know we were throwing out BDS and cultural boycott and all these kind of things. But you literally have an Israeli minister that says they see no difference between art and propaganda. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, if you're an artist, you have to sign a contract as a service provider, and as a service provider, if you don't, quote, promote the policy interests of the state of Israel, and you're in violation of that contract, and action can be taken against you. So when we look at the issue of Palestine or any other issue, you have 70 years of dispossession, you have a military occupation, a system of apartheid, bombs dropping. Like, the question becomes, like, what are we going to do about it? We can feel bad about it, we can say it's a horrible situation, or we can take action. And so when we look at U.S. complicity, it's like, it's not simply like, we're not doing the people of Vietnam a favor by not dropping bombs on them anymore. Like, that's not like being in solidarity. That's like cutting a line of complicity that you should be doing. So for me, it's like, yeah, prisons are bad, but it's like, cool, if there's a local campaign, like, let's support it. Let's get that, you know what I mean? Let's divest from that prison. So I think it's like, we don't just want to talk about the ethics within society or the human rights abuses. We actually want to challenge them. And if we're not organizing, and I don't mean to say that everybody should be a political poet and everybody, has to be a leftist organizer. But I think that, like, if you care about Fight for 15, figure out ways that you can support Fight for 15. If you care about your local co-op, make sure it stays open. So there's just little things that we can do. I think that we can shift our local and think a little bit more global at the same time.
Yeah, and particularly in New York, I mean, if you shift the narrative in New York, it sort of actually has sort of a magnitude effect kind of going outwards, like we are in the metropole, and the way that culture is shaped here, definitely nationally and to an extent internationally. So I think it actually really matters the way that we talk about things here, and the way that we think about things here as cultural workers. And which reminded me that actually in my introduction for Molly, I didn't say the piece that she has in this book is Molly came to Palestine with us on Palfest in 2015, and because she is the hardest working person around, before the festival was even over, she had found a way to get into Gaza and report from there. She wrote 2 pieces for Vice, one reporting from Hebron and one from Gaza. The Gaza piece is the one in this book, and I kind of just wanted to flag that up and ask you, how did you feel that piece or those pieces were received? How did your readers take them?
I mean, I was kind of a newbie to writing about Palestine. There are so many amazing journalists who have made that their beat, but they were actually received quite well, and by people that I wouldn't have necessarily thought would have cared about Palestine, or I thought might have even been hostile to them. I spent about a week in Gaza. When I was there, a Salafi group had shot incredibly ineffectual rockets into an Israeli field, and Israel retaliated by bombing Hamas facilities. And I remember I spent a night on a balcony hearing the drones overhead and listening to the shells fall. And I think when I was there, one of the things that I tried to capture in my piece is the incredible defiance and resilience and strength of spirit and just like straight spines of the people that I met there. And despite the fact that you're literally in this incredibly small strip of land where the only way that you can get commodities is through smugglers' tunnels that collapse all the time, very often, and where Israeli drones buzz above every night. And yet still people, they make businesses, and they rebuild their ruined homes, and they make art, and and they resist, and they live.
So I think we'll do one more question between us, and then we'll open up, because we've been 5 minutes. So you mentioned the sort of orange bastard at one point, or an orange something or other, and I guess it's inevitable to have to talk about it in some way, but I think the real question for me is, such a backbone of support for the Zionist project has been from liberal America, and what is going to happen now? I mean, as liberal Americans desert or oppose Trump on absolutely everything that he's doing, are they also going to oppose him on his support for Israel, or is that going to continue being the kind of paradoxical, exceptional, sort of nonsensical position? It's been a few months now. I don't really have a handle on. My feeling is, I don't know. Yeah, well, how do you two feel about that?
I think it's going to continue being the paradoxical, nonsensical thing. I mean, one thing that's so interesting is how much Netanyahu has been willing to collaborate not just with conservatives, but with like really hardcore anti-Semites, like people like Steve Bannon. Or recently there was this incredibly anti-Semitic campaign against George Soros in Hungary, and the Israeli foreign minister said that it was anti-Semitic to have people walk on top of his face when they were going into trains and stuff like that. And Netanyahu actually chided and disciplined his own minister because he thought that George Soros was too pro-Palestinian to deserve defending George Soros. So I think that perhaps one thing, that can shift liberal Jewish attitudes is seeing the complete willingness that someone like Netanyahu has to work with people who hate Jews, and also how someone like Netanyahu, certainly probably doesn't regard me as a Jew, for instance, and how he, like so many ethno-nationalists, only regards certain people as his people.
Yeah, I think the shift started before Trump, right? In the sense of when you look within, black folks, women, young Jewish folks, there has been a kind of shift on the issue of Palestine. I think it's been in reaction to mobilization, also to Israeli massacres. I think that there has been a constant, though, between the Obama administration and the Trump administration in a lot of ways. Whether that's drone bombs, whether that's spying, whether that's kicking out undocumented people. And on Palestine, Trump is going to be as terrible. If you look at Condoleezza Rice back, I think in 2006, was talking about a Gaza-West Bank corridor. So every successive administration has become more and more right-wing. I think that that's going to be the standard within U.S. politics. But you got, 350,000 members of Jewish Voice for Peace now, and Jews Say No, and Jews Against the Occupation. I just think that when it comes to young folks, things are really shifting, where people are saying well, the state doesn't really represent me, and it's militaristic, and we're militaristic, and I'm not really into militarism, so maybe I shouldn't support the state of Israel. I think that even that kind of, the younger generational shift is happening. And even within the concepts of liberal Zionism. Liberal Zionism was very much a victory of, I think, Palestinian mobilization, not self-reflection or introspection. It was well, we can't control the whole thing, so let's just steal 78% of the pie. And so today, it's now you're really pushing the rights for refugees. You're pushing the idea of getting rid of apartheid from the river to the sea. It's a lot of BS in terms of being against the occupation. But I think that the conversation is shifting. But we're also the last domino globally. The head of the forefront of the BDS movement today is in South Africa. You have mobilization in Chile. Then you're going to get your Norways and Swedens, and eventually your Australias and Canadas and UKs. And then the United States is going to come along kicking and screaming. So, we are the belly of the beast, the heart of the empire, the big protector. But I think that among the people, I've seen a huge shift that, the U.S. campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel formed in the aftermath of the bombing on Gaza in 2008 and 2009. I think Adela New York, an organization, some people are here in the room, formed after the bombing on Lebanon and Gaza in 2006. So people are moving. People are making connections. There's more support than ever before. It's just we have a hell of a lot of work to do, and we have a really long, steep uphill climb.
Before we open it to the floor, will you just explain why just being against the occupation is a nonsensical position?
Yeah, sure. My family's from Haifa and Jaffa. They were ethnically cleansed in 1948. I loved Nablus and Tulkarm and Gaza, but that's not where my family's from. There's more than 7 million Palestinian refugees globally. It's the thing that, on any question we can agree on more. You have more than 50 laws inside of the state of Israel that systematically discriminate against Palestinians, from labor, marriage, and other aspects of society. So it's not just, can we have a discontinuous segment of Bantustans in the occupied West Bank where Israel controls the air, the board, the sea, the imports, the exports, the taxes, and every facet of life, but it's that you want to strip away the systematic domination of another people. You have Palestinians inside of the state of Israel who have been there for generations and centuries, who are literally 6-7 miles away from their home that they were ethnically cleansed from in 1948, but because of Israeli law, they're not allowed to return to their homes and property, and Israelis are living in those homes today. So you don't want the crumbs that are brushed off the table. You want the.
What do you want?
To me, a one-state solution. for all people. I mean, look, it's like you can't come in and steal other people's land and say, you know, you're going to live under our boot for eternity. I mean, that's what people are kind of rejecting. I mean, even within South Africa, there's many comparisons and a lot of differences between the apartheid structure in South Africa and Palestine. But one of the arguments against getting rid of apartheid was that, you know, oh, we're going to be eaten alive. I mean, if you look at the racist rhetoric and a lot of the excuses, so Tom York says, you know, art brings people together, and I'm not about governments, I'm about the people. And I'm like, that's great, you pulled out of a playbook from 1983, when you had Jerry Falwell and Jesse Jackson in a conversation, I think back in 1986. And it's like, well, why have boycott and divestments against South Africa? Look across the African continent, there's much worse abusers. So I think that Israel is also smarter in some regards in the way that they've kind of reformulated their structure of oppression, but they're pulling from you know, a legacy of settler colonialism that isn't even just unique to there, and so I think that there's a lot of useful examples to look at throughout history and also the current reality.
All right. Thinking there can't be any questions after that. It's pretty straightforward.
So how long is it gonna take for them to, until, it's been a long time, since 48, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's gonna be like Ireland or something, saying,
Yeah, to me, it's not a question of is there a resolution or is there a positive resolution, like an equitable one, but how much pain and suffering do you stop in the interim? You know, I think that any people are going to yearn for freedom. Any people are going to buck back against the system of oppression. It's just a question of how does that system come crashing down? How much hurt and pain does it cause? And what is the actual time frame for that happening?
I have a question. Does anyone, any of you guys have any direct contact with anybody in Gaza right now? Because from what I understand, they only have 2 hours of electricity a day because Israel is cutting back the electricity. So hospitals are suffering in Gaza, people are suffering, it's summertime. Do any of you have contact with anybody there?
Yeah.
Talk about, please tell us.
No, I just have a Facebook friend who showed me around, and mostly when we talk, it's not really about like serious political matters like that. It's just like, you know, just bullshitting on Facebook like people do. But yeah, from everything I've seen, I mean, it's inhuman.
Yeah, you're right. The electricity is currently being very limited, and you know, obviously we're in summer, and this is causing huge problems. Did you say something we could do to help out, or?
No, I just wanted to know if any of you had contact with anybody there in Gaza
Yeah,
and had
no,
any more
yeah, we do.
information than from what I've been reading.
I mean, actually, if people want to, there's a group of people that I first met when we did Powerfest in Gaza in 2012. It was the year that the Egyptian revolution was still going relatively strong. We were able to pressure the Egyptian government to let in a group of mostly Arab authors through the Rafah checkpoint. And so we did the festival exclusively in Gaza that year. And I made friends with a guy called Anis who was running a cultural centre in Rafah. And he actually is constantly having to do crowdfunding appeals because he says that he's trying to put on a summer camp for children right now. He takes a group of about 40 at-risk children from very underprivileged families and just puts on a kind of holiday for them in Gaza. They can't get out. And about 3 times a year he has to do a crowdfunding campaign because there is literally no other source of funding or income. I mean, everything has been shut down. Israel has even arrested the head of like UNDP and other kind of NGO heads. So if anyone wants to do anything about that, they can go on the Powerfest Facebook page and see the Summer Camp for Gaza crowdfunder that's now running. Then, you know, they're trying to raise $5,000 or something, and they have to do that literally every 3 or 4 months. Yeah.
My question is actually related to the recent Wonder Woman movie. Gal Gadot being cast as this feminist figure of U.S. Culture right now, and she will be in the coming movies as well. My question is my difficulty to send the message across to my friends who are like good people that I know, but they're not willing to compromise for the love for new Wonder Woman movie. How do you have this conversation? And also another question is that recently Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he visited the state of Israel and had this collaboration with Benjamin Netanyahu. What what do you make of that?
Well, I mean, since Modi is an anti-Muslim bigot, it kind of all makes sense. The last time I was in India, I spent a month there at some literary festivals, and I spent a lot of time with Modi fans ambushing me and lecturing me about how great Trump was, and so I think that there's like Modi is part of this sort of constellation of demagogues, and also probably personally responsible for a pogrom in Gujarat. So it makes a lot of sense to me that he would like Netanyahu. I think that the answer when you're trying to get people to, I should not say this on camera, but when you're trying to get people to make a peace between their desire not to support someone who's doing something terrible, but also their desire to experience a cultural product, is probably tell them to engage in piracy.
Yeah, I mean, there's been like 386 articles on Wonder Woman. I mean, I think that when it comes to, I think that the Wonder Woman question is more of like a cultural question, whereas like,
Maybe you should synopsize it actually briefly. Just say why she's a problem.
yeah, so Gal Gadot served in the Israeli army, was very proud to serve in the Israeli army, was, part of a war on an occupied indigenous people. And so she is now cast in the lead as Wonder Woman. And so there were a lot of people that weren't exactly happy about that because, I mean, it's this idea that you are the manifestation of feminism, and it's that idea of, well, what's feminist about, dropping bombs on people and invading societies, and it's like, what are you really kind of like privileging in your conversation? So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of Palestinian feminists and feminists generally that wrote super critical pieces about, whether it's homo nationalism, whether it's this kind of idea of the militaristic industry, that settler colonialism and feminism don't really go well together. What was the question?
I mean, like, how do you converse with your friends, like, or family
He
members?
doesn't have
Do
any
you
friends,
know how to
Oh, how do you talk to people about it?
Yeah.
Look, it's how you talk to your friends is different than how you generally talk to the public. I mean, like in the sense of like, let's say you have sabra hummus, in your parents' fridge, and you want to talk to your parents about it. Like you're going to approach that conversation a heck of a lot differently than if you're talking to somebody you went to college with but you don't stay in touch with. When it comes to like interpersonal relationships, I think you got to base it on that, because there's a lot of folks that are like, well, I'm really against the occupation, but when it comes to my position on boycott, it makes people cringe. But I use the personal of the relationship to kind of like really get at them and kind of see what makes them tick, because I can tell you, well, why should you engage in boycott, or why should you not see a movie? But I can make the political argument. I think that kind of incorporating the personal and the political, depending on who that person is, how your relationship is, will probably make the most sense.
And one strategy I've had just when trying to convince people to do a boycott, so people's argument whenever you ask them to boycott anything is, but there's evil elsewhere in the world, right? This other thing is evil, so how can you boycott this unless you're trying to simultaneously boycott everything evil on earth and end all human suffering, right? And that's not how a boycott works. The purpose of a boycott is a strategic tool, right? It's doing something that, in the case of BDS, that's called for by Palestinian civil society, to pressure Israel to do certain actions. The purpose is not to end all evil everywhere on the earth, and it doesn't make you a hypocrite if you're not also boycotting every single evil and bad thing in the world. So I try to explain to people that it's a tactic, and that it's not actually hypocrisy. If you boycott Israeli state products, or if you boycott a business or whatever, but you aren't also ending all evil on earth.
Yeah, I think when it comes to BDS, it's very specifically different, right? It's like, this product is connected to this state that commits this crime. It's very 1-2. Like HP is very, very much connected to this kind of system and structure of oppression. Cultural boycott, we don't target individuals, we go after institutions. And it's like, well, why are you going after this institution? It's like, well, it has funding from the state. Or it's being used as part of Brand Israel. So there's very kind of like specific lines, whether operating on academic boycott, cultural boycott, or the consumer boycott front, where there's a direct line of complicity, and you're highlighting that complicity. So Tom York, for example, is going inside to play inside of a stadium that was built on an ethnically cleansed Palestinian village that is going to be used by the Israeli government for state propaganda. Whether it's Sun City in South Africa or apartheid in Palestine, you're stripping away the state the ability to use artistic voices for their propaganda purposes. So I think that specifically when it comes to BDS, there's kind of a protocol and it's a tactic. Again, it's not like you're not trying to bankrupt the state. You're trying to make sure that companies or institutions know that business can't go on as usual, and we need to challenge those systems and structures of oppression in tactical ways.
Yeah, and also, I mean, people are always saying, you know, how come we don't boycott North Korea? And then, but like, we don't have North Korean hummus in our supermarket, or there aren't North Korean superstars on TV. And on the Modi question, I was going to say, Pankaj Mishra, who is really one of the great theorists of the present, has his article in this book is about exactly that. It's about how he went to Palestine and understood actually the ideological convergences between India and Israel, and how, I mean, I'll let his piece talk for itself, but it's a highlight. Actually, I'll come back to you a second. I'm going to go to you because you're kind of hidden.
Sure.
Yeah.
You talked at the end about goals for movements like BDS, and one of the goals you mentioned was one-state solution. And I just wanted to know what efforts there are to normalize the idea of a one-state solution, because a lot of sympathetic liberals in America and Canada, to them the idea of a one-state solution is quite remarkable and not really considered. Sort of the default is somehow that the two-state solution will be viable, or the most viable, and given sort of the uphill battles that have already taken place to even get to, you know, where the movements are, you know, what your thoughts are on pushing the rock further up the hill.
I always just show people a map, and I'm like, how are you going to have a two-state solution when Gaza is over here and the West Bank is over here? Are you going to have flying cars? This doesn't make any sense. And then I'm like, you know, when people live in a body of land, they all deserve to vote and have equal rights regardless of what their race is. And that's generally been my best arguing tactic.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, like in terms of BDS doesn't call for one state or two states. But when it comes to like what is a fair and just solution to the situation, like it's not that the two-state solution is dead, it's that it never existed, right? I mean, I mentioned Israel controls the air, the border, the sea, the imports, the exports. You have 600,000 settlers in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israel controls the West Bank water aquifer. Even when you look at Camp David in 2000, which is the closest we ever got to a two-state solution, Israel was going to control 90% of it. It was going to control the Jordan Valley. It was going to control every facet of Palestinian life. So there's never been a real idea of a two-state solution presented, nor do I think that any Israeli governments, not the dovish ones and not the current fascist ones, that operate in the same way. They both massacre Palestinians. They both expand. I mean, if you look at the biggest expansion of settlements, it has been historically under labor governments, under the so-called liberal governments within Israel. So I think that it's kind of fantasy talk that is used as a tactic to steal even more Palestinian land and create facts on the ground, where Gaza is split off from the rest of Palestine, where status is being stripped from Jerusalem residents by the day, where land is being carved up and resources are being stripped away. And even when you look at the policies within the Negev or the Nakab in the south of Israel, or the Galilee today, the same policies are being put in place there today with the same logic than they are within East Jerusalem and the West Bank. So this notion that the Israeli state looks at it as separate entities, or the idea that you're going to one day have a two-state solution, is really bogus. It has as much hatred and targets as much its own Palestinian citizens of Israel than it does the residents of the other 22% of historic Palestine.
Yeah, and I think on your question of like how is it going to happen, I mean, I think it's two things. On the one hand, it's like Robin said, it's something that is being forced into the consciousness of people because we realise, or because the world is waking up to the fact that there is no two-state solution, and that actually, since they began talking about it, I mean, what officially did they really begin talking about in '94, or even in '48, whatever? It's actually just been a mechanism to buy time and distract people as the land is colonised bit by bit, and so it's something that is just kind of forcing itself into a central place within the discourse. I mean, really, I think when you look at who's talking about two-state solution, it's only other people who have something in the immediate short term to gain from it, or they're Zionists, or they're obfuscating the truth for ideological reasons. And so it is something that I think is sort of emerging into the kind of centrality of discourse. And again, because we are here to sell this book, I'm going to say, so that we have a new map that we made. We couldn't find a map that we thought actually reflected the realities of how things are and how actually it is a one state, and that is the only solution possible. And so, together with a professional map maker, obviously I didn't do this, we kind of created a new map that I think is a sort of better reflection of the kind of political realities of right now in Palestine. I'm going to go to the woman behind you because I promised that she would be next.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to speak very quickly that I'm 100% for the Palestinian cause, but I don't think you're doing yourself any big favors by joining with a lot of these other groups, and I really saw an example of that up at a protest at Times Square, and I'll tell you why. But to go back to what's been going on, years ago there was a book written by one journalist and a historian called The Israel Lobby. I don't know if you've read it or you're familiar with
very
it.
important book.
I mean, it tells you very clearly why every single politician, everybody who becomes the leader of this country will go on the side of Israel. Honey, if you think Hillary Clinton is any different, you're dead
I
wrong.
don't.
Thank you, but she's not. But I'll refrain for what I usually call her. But the reason why I'm telling you that you're not helping yourself is when I went to this protest, there were signs of Palestinian people who were on hunger strikes and all the rest, and okay, that was fine. But then you saw people coming up with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the down with capitalism, down with this, down with that, and all it did was dissipate out your message, which is really kind of unique. I just got back from Lebanon last month. There are, 700,000 Palestinian refugees there, 2 million Syrian refugees. It is a unique situation. It waters down your message. They were turning people off because when they started to sing out, they had this phrase that they were saying, we don't believe in two-state solution, we want infanticide or revolution. People started to walk away. It doesn't help. It doesn't help your cause. The other issue is you do have Palestinians separated all over. Not only, yes, they're Palestinians, but some are Sunni, some are Shia. You had Hezbollah up in Lebanon who were doing a very nice job controlling the area up there and watching the border. And then you have the Sunnis and you have Hamas. So it's not simply Israel versus Palestine. It's this difference within the Palestinians, actually within the Muslim world. If the Shia and Sunni could ever get along, you'd be the most powerful force.
Before we go down that, yeah,
Why, do you see what I'm saying?
no, and I
It's
think
not-
we're agreed in that, of course, like these are, like we're saying, Palestine is at the centre of a sort of larger intersectional issue of empire and
I mean, look, what I would say to that, I mean, I can't speak to the exact protest that you're at. But I mean, I say this as a Palestinian, I don't think Palestine is unique. I don't think that Palestinians are more deserving than anyone else. And I'm sorry, but like I also live here in a settler colonial state that continues to strip away native land and resources. And I don't want to juxtapose U.S. goodness versus Israeli badness as if they're not a logic that complements each other. And you have 2.3 million people in jail and prisons and anti-black racism and cops killing people in the streets every day. And yeah, we need to give a fuck about that. We need to do something
I
about
agree with what you're
and-
saying,
but-
but
and I'm-
on the other hand, look at the violent crime statistics in New York City alone.
Another question,
That.
please. Does
No,
anyone else have another
Who
question?
just killed a cop?
What's your question?
So I think this is kind
Be
of
realistic.
building off the previous conversation about discourse, right? And like the fact that 10 years ago you couldn't say Palestine. Today it's a little difficult to say one-state solution, and like the question is that and we say that we're arriving at that, and I think that's partially due to like poor progress to a huge extent. That like discourse takes a lot of labor and a lot of rigor, and that it's a lot of times. And I'll get to my question in a couple of seconds. Sorry, but like basically, so the question is like the fact that the nature of the labor and the rigor that this kind of discourse requires, usually is one that is warded off by the necessities of living, especially in a place like New York, especially as an immigrant, if you're an immigrant, if you're performing for a predominantly white community or for a predominantly liberal community. And so my question is, what are ways to kind of, other than like, having communities that come together, what are ways to kind of undermine these serious threats to this kind of labor that is required for these threats of having to survive, of having to, not have a bad argument with your boss about for a company that's going to, Israeli product of, for example, yeah, like there are obvious forms of policing, and my question was like, what are your strategies to deal with these forms of like policing that are a little softer and they're present in a lot of products.
I mean, I don't work at a law firm, but so maybe like don't go put a boycott Israel sticker on your boss's computer. So in terms of I don't know, navigating those spaces.
Like how you do your activism that might offend or alienate a number of people in power while also not going broke because you can't have a job while doing it at the same time. How to balance those things? Well, I think we need to create really strong models that support artists and that support writers who are people of color and who are political. There needs to be grants, there needs to be speaking opportunities, there needs to be paid spots for people doing that sort of work, and just for like a diverse group of like artists and journalists and writers and musicians, because that would address a lot of the economic problems and also the self-censorship that can come if you think that your only employment opportunities are going to come with people who deeply disagree with you. Another thing is, right now, the alt-right is targeting all sorts of professors, all sorts of academics and public figures, even comedians, for all sorts of views. But I feel that the targeting of BDS activists was a canary in the coal mine for the type of censorship and repression of speech that many other types of academics and many other types of writers are experiencing now. And I think another thing that needs to happen is that when intellectuals and writers and artists are targeted for a BDS thing, there needs to be hardcore solidarity with them.
Do you mean specific? Do you mean like within artistic spaces or like mainstream spaces?
Well, I personally am like an artist and cultural worker, so that probably was in my mind. But I feel like discourse, generally speaking, happens a lot around art.
Yeah, I mean, just to say quickly on that, I mean, look, I think that there's a lack of support for radical art generally within the U.S. And if you look at the word apartheid, right, Israeli Apartheid Week formed out of Toronto, it's because people put that into the discourse. And a lot of people at the time were like, well, this is too radical, it's never going to stick with people, and they kind of pushed on. And then you get, now it's kind of like part of the vernacular, or Jimmy Carter, even though using it in a limited way, and on and on. But also looking for alternative artistic spaces, right? You do have radical poets today. You do have, you do have artists that are kind of bucking the trends of what society is telling them to do. So also seeking out those spaces. I mean, I don't think that I'm speaking at Lincoln Center next week, and that's okay. But that's also not the purpose of my art. So also like figuring out like how your art is in conversation with the larger role within society. So I think that there's we can talk about cool groups in New York doing art, and maybe we can link up.
But I think, this is going to come to a head now, because what's happening, particularly here in New York, is that Cuomo has signed this legislation trying to illegalize BDS. And they say they're drawing up blacklists of companies and organizations that have signed on or promote the boycott of Israel anyway. And so this is obviously a free speech issue. You are free to spend your money where you want, or not spend your money where you want, and to be forced to spend your money or to engage with a government that you don't believe in. I mean, this is absurd. And so I think people have to be able to, or people have to be ready to take risks and make sacrifices, because there are going to be a couple of martyrs along the way with this fight, particularly with Cuomo, I think. And we're going to see who those people are, and it's coming to a head now. I think we're going to take one more and then I'll wrap it up.
Yeah, you speak with high conviction about the concept of a single state. Can you explain how do you envision this single state in practical terms?
Sure.
How many of us don't have the don't see it actually happening in practicality. So how do you envision it?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that first you strip away the kind of structures of discrimination. I mean, again, like I think there's a lot of comparisons and differences to other models. there are a lot of smarter people that have done case studies or have done work on, I mean, if you look at Badil or Zakhrot, which is an Israeli organization, imagining like what does return look like in a sub-district of Haifa, 11 years from now. So I think that if you look at the fact that 1.8 million Palestinians live inside of the state of Israel, but they live under second-class status, I mean, step one is to strip that away. Implementing the right of return isn't actually a hard thing when you actually look at the land across what is now the Israeli state today. There's enough land. If you look at 531 plus destroyed villages, the lands are still there. A lot of it is unpopulated. So I think that what step one looks like is really kind of like pulling back the curtain on the apartheid system, taking down those laws, and actually addressing the fundamental questions that are there, which is ending the occupation and systematic domination of a people, implementing the right of return. What is it?
But eventually it means the existence of a single state and not the existence of Israel. Is that what you're proposing? When you say single state?
Yeah, I mean, it's a state
Yes.
for all the people, from the river to the sea. Yeah.
Right. No.
And
so-
I don't think people should be afraid of that.
No, I just want to understand. So
Yeah, yeah.
it means the non-existence of Israel in a single state.
But what is Israel's existence today? So okay. So look, if
No, but Israel as a state, does it mean?
In other words, what
Well,
would be
as a
called?
Zionist
That's the
state?
question.
It will no longer
Not
be
as a
Jewish
Zionist
state.
That's what I'm asking.
Not, it would not
yeah,
exist
maybe
as a Zionist
I mean,
Right.
it's almost like does South
Just trying to
Africa
understand.
not
Just
exist
saying.
today?
Yeah.
Sorry?
I mean, does South Africa not exist today? I mean, it still has 1,000,001 problems, economic apartheid, and on. We can talk about that. But the state doesn't stop being. It's what makes up the state is how the state functions.
Okay.
And so if the state is functioning as a dominant body for ethno-religious supremacy, that's the problem. And how you strip away those structures is going to be informed by committees and other people smarter than me. But and there are differences on what that actual one-state outlook looks like in terms of parliament, in terms of state structures, in terms of mapping out what the right of return can look like. I do think so. It's like I've been to one-state conferences, and I do think that it's important not just to talk about the right of return, but imagining what return looks like, or what does return, how does return in practice look like 20 years after they did return? So not just imagining how are we taking down the structures of apartheid, occupation, and settler colonialism, but what does the eventuality look like? And I don't mean to say that everything is going to be perfect and people are going to be skipping together, holding hands, and everything is going to be better, but it's a hell of a lot better than the system that we have in place. And in the one-state solution itself, it's important to understand is that it's a compromise. I mean, folks aren't saying you need to go back to where you came from. It's like, just stop oppressing us. Like, if you want to be about us living equitably together, then it has to be 100% in real terms. It can't be with the idea that you're still going to take my house, you're still going to take my land, but you're just going to call it something different.
All right. Well, I think you want to say something.
Oh, no,
I'm going to wrap up.
yes,
so
wrap
now's
up,
the
wrap
time.
up.
Okay, well, we've been talking about narratives, we've been talking about the media, and I think I want to point out that this book is only possible because Bloomsbury got behind it, and Alexandra Pringle, the editor-in-chief, is here today. So thank you to Alexandra. She's been a terrific supporter of Palestinian literature and of the festival. Bloomsbury published Susan Abel Hawa, Selma Dabber, and now this. Yeah, tremendous props to Bloomsbury. Thank you to Remy, thank you to Rodney.
You can feel free to get a book, sign or talk to others and so on before heading upstairs on your way out. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks for talking.